Okinawa, 1945. American soldiers stood in lines holding strange metal pumps filled with white powder. The order was clear: spray it under the skirts of Japanese women prisoners. No exceptions. When Private Tommy O'Brien first heard the command, he froze. His hands trembled as he gripped the DDT canister. The women before him looked terrified, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. What was happening here seemed wrong on every level. But what Tommy and these women didn't know yet would change everything they thought about this moment. Lieutenant Daniel Crawford had seen death in every form during the Pacific War. Bullet wounds, burns, infections that turned men's skin black before taking their lives. But nothing prepared him for what he witnessed at the Okinawa civilian internment camp in late 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Yet a different kind of battle was just beginning. One fought not with bullets but with a mysterious white powder that would save thousands of lives while creating one of the most misunderstood moments in wartime history. Daniel arrived at the camp on a humid September morning. The air was thick with salt from the nearby ocean and something else, something that made his medical training kick into high gear. The smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of desperation. Captain Robert Henderson, the senior medical officer, met him at the entrance. Henderson's face was grave, lined with exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Daniel, we have a crisis," Henderson said without preamble. "Typhus. We've already lost 17 prisoners in the past week. If we don't act now, this entire camp could become a death trap." Typhus. Daniel knew the disease well from his medical training. Caused by bacteria transmitted through body lice, it had killed millions throughout history. During World War I, typhus claimed more lives on the Eastern Front than combat itself. The disease started with fever and headaches, then progressed to a distinctive rash, delirium, and in many cases death. The mortality rate could reach 30% in untreated cases. But that wasn't the worst part. Typhus spread like wildfire in crowded, unsanitary conditions. A prison camp full of malnourished, traumatized people was the perfect breeding ground. Henderson led Daniel through the camp. Rows of makeshift barracks stretched in every direction, housing thousands of Japanese civilians and former military personnel. Women, children, elderly men, all crammed together in spaces designed for half their number. The conditions were harsh, not from deliberate cruelty, but from the simple reality of war's aftermath. The American forces were overwhelmed, dealing with millions of displaced people across the Pacific. Resources were stretched impossibly thin, and now, typhus threatened to turn this already difficult situation into a catastrophe. "We received a shipment 3 days ago," Henderson explained, gesturing to several large barrels stacked near the medical tent. "DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. It's a pesticide. Kills lice on contact. The brass wants us to dust every prisoner in this camp. Every single one." Daniel had heard of DDT. It was relatively new, first synthesized in the 1800s but only recognized for its insecticidal properties in 1939 by Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller. The military had been using it in Europe with remarkable success, controlling typhus outbreaks among refugees and prisoners of war. But hearing about it and actually implementing it were two very different things. The next morning, Daniel stood before a group of 30 soldiers explaining the procedure. "You'll use these hand pumps to spray DDT powder directly onto the prisoners' bodies," he instructed, demonstrating with the canister. "Focus on areas where lice congregate: hair, underarms, waistbands, and yes, underskirts and in undergarments. The lice hide in the warmest, most concealed areas of clothing. If we miss those spots, we miss the lice, and people die." The soldiers listened, but Daniel could see the discomfort in their faces. Tommy O'Brien, barely 19, raised his hand. "Sir, the women, they're going to think we're, Daniel cut him off. "I know how it looks, Private. That's why we'll have female interpreters explain the procedure first. But understand this. We're not asking for permission. This is a public health emergency. If we don't do this, hundreds will die." The reality was even more complicated than Daniel anticipated. The Japanese prisoners had every reason to distrust American soldiers. Propaganda during the war had painted Americans as brutal monsters who would torture and kill captives. Many of these women had hidden in caves during the Battle of Okinawa, preferring potential death to capture. Some had witnessed atrocities. Others had lost everything: homes, family members, their entire way of life. And now strange foreign soldiers wanted to spray them with unknown powder in intimate areas of their bodies. The fear was palpable. Sachiko Hayashi emerged as a natural leader among the women prisoners. At 30, she had been a schoolteacher before the war, educated and composed even in these desperate circumstances. When the American interpreters explained the DDT procedure, Sachiko listened carefully, then translated for the other women in her barracks. But translation wasn't enough to overcome the terror. One elderly woman began weeping, convinced this was some form of chemical warfare. A young mother clutched her children, refusing to let the soldiers near them. The barracks erupted in frightened voices, each woman's fear feeding the others. Sachiko raised her hand for silence. She spoke in Japanese, her voice steady despite her own uncertainty. I do not trust these Americans. I do not understand why they would help us after we were enemies. But I have seen the sick women in Barrack 7. I have watched them suffer with fever, watched the rash spread across their bodies, watched them die. If this powder can stop that, then perhaps we must endure this humiliation. She paused, meeting the eyes of the women around her. Or we can refuse, and watch more of our sisters and children die from the lice that crawl on all of us. The choice is ours, but we must choose quickly. Among the prisoners was Akiko Watanabe, 24, who had served as a nurse in the Japanese military. She had treated wounded soldiers, seen the effects of disease, understood medical necessity in ways the other prisoners didn't. But even Akiko's medical knowledge couldn't fully overcome her fear. She had heard whispers of what happened to captured nurses, stories that made her blood run cold. When the American soldiers entered the barracks with their strange metal canisters, Akiko felt her heart racing. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think like a nurse rather than a frightened prisoner. She watched as the first woman stepped forward for the procedure. The soldier, Tommy O'Brien, looked almost as scared as the prisoner. His hand shook as he operated the hand pump, sending clouds of white DDT powder onto the woman's hair and clothing. Another soldier, under Daniel's supervision, used a longer nozzle to spray under the woman's skirt, keeping his eyes averted, his movements quick and professional. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. The woman emerged coated in white powder, looking like a ghost but unharmed. She turned to the others and said simply, "It's just powder. It doesn't hurt." Slowly, fearfully, other women began to form a line. When Akiko's turn came, she approached Lieutenant Crawford directly. In broken English, she asked, "This powder, it kills the lice?" Daniel was surprised to be addressed in English. He nodded. "Yes, it's called DDT. Very effective against insects. No harm to humans in these doses." Akiko studied his face, looking for deception. She had learned during her nursing training to read people, to spot lies that could endanger patients. What she saw in Daniel's eyes wasn't malice or cruelty, but exhaustion and genuine concern. She bowed slightly, then submitted to the procedure, closing her eyes as the white powder covered her hair and clothing, as the nozzle sprayed under her skirt. It felt strange, violating in its intimacy despite the clinical nature. But it didn't hurt. It was just powder. Over the next 3 days, Daniel and his medical team processed thousands of prisoners. The work was grueling, repetitive, and emotionally draining. Each person received a thorough dusting: hair, armpits, waistbands, and the areas where body lice preferred to hide. For the women, this meant spraying under skirts and into undergarments. For men, into trouser legs and shirt collars. Children cried, frightened by the strange powder and the foreign soldiers. Elderly prisoners needed extra assistance, some too weak to stand for the procedure. Through it all, Daniel and Henderson pushed their team forward, knowing that every hour of delay meant more infections, more deaths. Tommy O'Brien gradually became desensitized to the intimate nature of the work. What had seemed shocking and inappropriate on the first day became routine medical procedure by the third. He learned to work efficiently, to keep his eyes on the equipment rather than the people, to treat each prisoner with the same quick, respectful professionalism. One afternoon, a young Japanese girl, maybe 6 years old, smiled at him after her dusting, reaching out to touch the white powder on her arm with curiosity rather than fear. Tommy felt something shift inside him. These weren't faceless enemies. They were people, families, children who had gotten caught in a war they didn't start. The transformation in Sachiko was more gradual but profound. On the 4th day after the dusting, she noticed something remarkable. The constant itching that had plagued her for months was gone. She ran her fingers through her hair and found no lice. She checked her clothing and found the seams empty of the tiny insects that had been constant companions. Around her, other women reported the same thing. The lice were dead. All of them. The white powder had worked exactly as the Americans promised. More importantly, no new cases of typhus appeared in the dusted barracks. The sick women began to recover, their fevers breaking, their rashes fading. Sachiko sought out Lieutenant Crawford a week after the dusting. Through an interpreter, she thanked him. Daniel, exhausted from another long day, simply nodded. "We did what needed to be done," he said. But Sachiko shook her head. "You could have let us die. We were your enemies. You won the war. But instead, you saved us." Why? Daniel had asked himself the same question during the sleepless nights. "Because the war is over," he finally answered. "And you're not enemies anymore. You're just people who need help." Sachiko bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect that Daniel didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. Akiko's journey took a different turn. Her medical knowledge and English skills made her valuable to the American medical team. Henderson asked her to help with translation and with identifying sick prisoners who needed additional treatment. Working alongside Daniel, Akiko began to see the American military doctors not as conquerors or threats, but as fellow medical professionals trying to solve an impossible problem with limited resources. One evening, as they reviewed patient charts, Daniel asked her about her nursing training. Akiko described her education in Tokyo, her work in field hospitals, the desperate attempts to treat wounded soldiers with inadequate supplies. "We were not so different, you and I," Akiko said quietly. "We both tried to heal people in the middle of war. We both saw things that will never leave our minds." Daniel nodded, feeling a kinship with this former enemy nurse that transcended nationality or politics. The war had made them adversaries, but medicine made them colleagues. They had both taken oaths to preserve life, to relieve suffering. The white powder dusting, as uncomfortable and undignified as it had been, was an extension of that oath. It was preventive medicine on a massive scale, using new technology to stop an ancient killer. The success of the DDT program at Okinawa was dramatic and undeniable. Within 2 weeks, typhus cases dropped to 0. The lice infestation that had plagued the camp was completely eliminated. Prisoners who had been sick with early-stage typhus recovered fully. Perhaps most tellingly, no soldiers or medical staff contracted the disease, despite close contact with infected prisoners. The barrier of dead lice created by DDT had protected everyone. Reports of the success spread throughout the Pacific Theater. Other camps began implementing similar programs. By the end of 1945, DDT dusting had become standard procedure in displaced persons camps, prisoner facilities, and refugee centers across Asia and Europe. Captain Henderson called Daniel into his office one afternoon to share news from headquarters. "The brass is calling it a miracle pesticide," Henderson said, showing Daniel reports from camps in Europe. In Naples, they stopped a typhus epidemic that could have killed hundreds of thousands. In Germany, they're dusting concentration camp survivors. "The numbers are staggering, Daniel. We're talking about millions of lives saved." Daniel felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. "We violated their dignity," he said. "We sprayed powder into intimate areas without real consent." Henderson's expression grew serious. "We did," he acknowledged. "But the alternative was letting them die from a preventable disease. Sometimes in medicine, we have to choose between bad options and worse options. History will judge whether we chose correctly." History's judgment on DDT would indeed be complex. In the immediate post-war period, the chemical was hailed as a lifesaver, earning its discoverer, Paul Miller, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1948. The citation specifically mentioned DDT's role in controlling typhus and malaria, diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. Military and civilian health organizations used DDT extensively throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Malaria, which had killed millions annually, was eliminated from entire regions through DDT spraying programs. Typhus, once a feared epidemic disease, became rare and controllable. But the story didn't end there. By the 1960s, scientists began documenting DDT's environmental impact. The chemical persisted in the environment for years, accumulating in the fatty tissues of animals. Birds, particularly raptors like eagles and falcons, experienced reproductive failures as DDT caused their eggshells to thin and break. Rachel Carson's landmark 1962 book, Silent Spring, documented these effects and sparked the modern environmental movement. DDT was banned for agricultural use in the United States in 1972 and subsequently in many other countries. The miracle pesticide had become an environmental villain. Yet even this condemnation was not absolute. DDT continued to be used in limited applications for disease control, particularly malaria prevention in developing countries where the disease remained a major killer. The World Health Organization acknowledged that in certain contexts, the benefits of DDT in preventing disease outweighed the environmental costs. The debate over DDT became emblematic of a larger question. How do we balance immediate human needs against long-term environmental protection? It was a question without easy answers, a tension that continues to shape public health policy today. For the prisoners at Okinawa in 1945, these future debates were unknown and irrelevant. What mattered was the immediate reality. The lice were gone, the typhus had stopped, and people were surviving who would have died without intervention. Sachiko, Akiko, and thousands of others returned to their lives carrying a strange memory of American soldiers spraying white powder under their skirts. It was undignified, frightening at the time, and deeply uncomfortable. But it was also medical care when they desperately needed it. Disease prevention that saved their lives and the lives of their children. Tommy O'Brien returned home to Boston in 1946, carrying memories that would shape the rest of his life. He never forgot the frightened faces of the Japanese prisoners, never forgot the strange intimacy of the DDT dusting, never forgot the moment when that little girl smiled at him. Years later, working as a public health inspector, Tommy would often think about Okinawa when implementing disease control measures. He understood viscerally the tension between public health necessity and individual dignity, between what was medically required and what felt personally invasive. That understanding made him better at his job, more empathetic, more aware of the human dimension of health policy. Lieutenant Daniel Crawford remained in military medicine, eventually becoming a colonel and a leading expert in tropical diseases. He published several papers on the Okinawa DDT program, always careful to mention both its successes and its ethical complications. In lectures to medical students, Daniel emphasized the importance of cultural sensitivity, of explaining procedures to patients, of obtaining meaningful consent whenever possible. But he also taught about triage, about emergency measures, about the hard decisions doctors sometimes face when perfect solutions don't exist. The white powder incident, as he called it, became a teaching case study in military and public health ethics. Akiko Watanabe emigrated to the United States in 1952, completed nursing certification in California, and worked for 30 years at a veterans hospital in Los Angeles. She treated American veterans of the Pacific War, including some who might have fought against Japanese forces that included her brothers. Her patients never knew her history, never knew she had been a prisoner at Okinawa, never knew about the white powder dusting, but Akiko carried those memories always, a reminder of how enemies could become healers for each other, how medicine could transcend the hatreds of war. Sachiko Hayashi returned to Okinawa after the occupation ended, becoming a community leader and advocate for survivors. She never forgot the day the Americans came with their metal canisters and white powder. In her 80s, interviewed for a historical project, Sachiko described the experience with remarkable clarity. "We thought they were going to hurt us," she said. "We were terrified. The soldiers putting powder under our skirts, it felt like violation, like the ultimate humiliation. But they were saving our lives. They were killing the lice that would have killed us. I hated it and I am grateful for it, both at the same time. It is possible to feel both things together. That duality, that capacity to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, perhaps best captures the reality of the DDT dusting program. It was an invasion of privacy performed to preserve life. It was cultural insensitivity in service of medical necessity. It was young soldiers following orders that made them uncomfortable in order to prevent deaths. It was frightened prisoners submitting to procedures they didn't understand from people they had every reason to fear. It was all of these things at once. A moment when war, medicine, culture, and human vulnerability intersected in the most intimate and uncomfortable way possible. The broader historical context makes the story even more complex. The development and use of DDT was part of a larger transformation in how humanity approached disease control. For thousands of years, epidemic diseases like typhus, malaria, plague, and cholera had been uncontrollable forces of nature, killing millions and shaping the course of history. Armies lost more soldiers to disease than combat. Cities were periodically devastated by epidemics. Entire populations lived in constant fear of invisible microbial enemies. The 20th century changed that. Antibiotics, vaccines, improved sanitation, and yes, pesticides like DDT gave humanity unprecedented power over infectious diseases. But that power came with responsibilities and consequences that weren't immediately apparent. DDT killed lice and mosquitoes, but it also accumulated in ecosystems, harming birds and potentially affecting human health through long-term exposure. The same chemical properties that made it effective, its persistence and fat solubility, also made it an environmental hazard. Later generations would have to grapple with cleaning up the legacy of DDT use while acknowledging that it had saved millions of lives. Neither celebrating DDT uncritically nor condemning it absolutely captures the full truth. It was a powerful tool that was both necessary in its time and problematic in its long-term effects. The personal stories reveal another dimension. Private Tommy O'Brien, barely out of high school, thrust into a situation where he had to spray powder under women's skirts while they looked at him with terrified eyes. Lieutenant Daniel Crawford, trained to heal, having to implement a program that felt like assault even as he knew it was saving lives. Sachiko Hayashi, trying to protect the women in her care while navigating between justified fear and medical necessity. Akiko Watanabe, using her medical knowledge to bridge cultures and help people survive. Each of them carried the weight of that moment differently, each processing the experience through their own lens of culture, training, and personal ethics. The logistics of the operation were staggering. At Okinawa alone, over 50,000 prisoners were dusted in less than 3 weeks. Multiply that across dozens of camps throughout the Pacific and European theaters, and you're looking at millions of people processed through DDT delousing programs. The amount of pesticide used was enormous. Tons of white powder sprayed onto human bodies and clothing. Soldiers operated the hand pumps until their arms ached. Medical officers worked 18-hour days organizing the effort. Interpreters tried to explain and reassure frightened prisoners. It was a massive public health intervention, unprecedented in scale and conducted under the chaotic conditions of immediate post-war occupation. The technology itself was relatively simple. DDT powder in metal canisters, distributed through hand-operated pumps similar to agricultural sprayers. The application method was crude but effective. Coat the person thoroughly with powder, making sure to reach areas where lice congregate. No sophisticated equipment, no complex medical procedures, just pesticide directly applied to clothed bodies. This simplicity was part of DDT's appeal. It required minimal training, worked quickly, and could be deployed rapidly in field conditions. A small team could process hundreds of people per day. In a military context where speed and efficiency were paramount, DDT was ideal. But simplicity in application didn't mean simplicity in impact. The psychological and cultural effects were profound and long-lasting. For many Japanese prisoners, the DDT dusting became a defining memory of the occupation, a moment of vulnerability and helplessness. For American soldiers, it was often their first close contact with the enemy population, a confusing mixture of victor's authority and medical caregivers' concern. The interpreters, often Japanese Americans who faced their own complicated relationship with both cultures, had to navigate impossible emotional terrain, explaining procedures that seemed inexplicable. Contemporary news reports from 1945 show how the DDT program was portrayed to the American public. Newspapers ran photos of soldiers dusting prisoners, often with captions emphasizing American humanitarian efforts and medical advancement. The intimate nature of the procedure was downplayed or described in clinical terms. The fear and discomfort of the prisoners were rarely mentioned. Instead, the narrative focused on American efficiency, scientific progress, and magnanimity toward defeated enemies. This sanitized version served propaganda purposes, but missed the complex human reality of the experience. Japanese accounts from the period, when they exist at all, tell a different story. Survivors' testimonies describe confusion, fear, and humiliation. Many prisoners genuinely believed they were being poisoned or sterilized. Rumors spread through the camps that the white powder was a form of chemical warfare, that it would make women infertile, that it was revenge for wartime atrocities. The cultural context made the situation even more fraught. Traditional Japanese society placed enormous emphasis on modesty and propriety, particularly for women. Having foreign male soldiers spray powder underskirts was a profound violation of cultural norms, regardless of medical justification. The interpreters played a crucial but often overlooked role in the DDT program's success. These were typically Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who spoke both languages and understood both cultures. Many had been detained in internment camps in the United States during the war, then recruited for military service or translation work. Their position was impossibly complicated, discriminated against by their own country, viewed with suspicion by both Americans and Japanese, yet essential for communication and cultural mediation. When they explained the DDT procedure to frightened prisoners, they were asking for trust from people who had no reason to trust anyone. Medical ethics in 1945 were very different from modern standards. The concept of informed consent existed but was applied inconsistently, particularly in military contexts. Patients' rights, cultural sensitivity, and ethical oversight of medical procedures were far less developed than today. The DDT dusting program would not pass modern ethical review boards. There was no genuine informed consent, no opportunity for prisoners to refuse treatment, no consideration of cultural sensitivities, and no long-term follow-up on potential health effects. By contemporary standards, it was ethically problematic. By the standards of immediate post-war emergency medicine in occupied territory, it was standard practice. This raises uncomfortable questions about medical necessity and coercion. When does public health emergency justify overriding individual autonomy? How much discomfort and violation of dignity is acceptable to prevent disease? Who gets to make these decisions, and how are the affected populations included in the decision-making process? These questions remain relevant today, surfacing in debates about mandatory vaccination, quarantine measures, and disease surveillance. The DDT dusting of 1945 provides a historical case study in the tension between collective health and individual rights. The scientific understanding of typhus in 1945 was fairly advanced. Doctors knew it was caused by Rickettsia prowazekii bacteria, transmitted through the feces of infected body lice. When lice feed on human blood, they defecate, and the bacteria-laden feces can enter the body through breaks in the skin or mucous membranes. The disease incubates for 1 to 2 weeks, then strikes with high fever, severe headache, and a characteristic rash that spreads from the trunk to the extremities. Without treatment, mortality rates range from 10 to 60%, depending on the strain and the patient's overall health. Malnourished, stressed prisoners faced the highest risk. The only way to stop typhus transmission was to eliminate the lice. Before DDT, this meant labor-intensive methods: shaving hair, boiling clothing, manual inspection and removal of lice and nits. These methods were time-consuming, often ineffective, and impossible to implement on the scale needed in large prisoner camps. People could be deloused manually only to become reinfested days later. The lice lived in clothing seams, in hair, in bedding, creating a constant cycle of reinfestation. DDT broke that cycle completely. One thorough dusting killed all lice on the person and provided residual protection for weeks. It was a revolutionary approach to an ancient problem. The residual effect of DDT was key to its effectiveness. Unlike other pesticides that broke down quickly, DDT remained active for weeks or months after application. Lice that came into contact with dusted clothing or skin would die. This created a protective barrier that prevented reinfestation even in crowded, unsanitary conditions where lice were endemic. From a public health standpoint, this residual protection was invaluable. It meant that a single application could provide protection through the critical period, while camps improved sanitation, distributed clean clothing, and established hygiene protocols. However, this same residual persistence would later become DDT's downfall. What made it effective in disease control made it dangerous to ecosystems. DDT doesn't break down easily in the environment. It accumulates in fatty tissues of animals and concentrates as it moves up the food chain, a process called biomagnification. Predatory birds at the top of the food chain accumulated dangerous levels of DDT, leading to reproductive failure and population crashes. The bald eagle, America's national symbol, nearly went extinct due to DDT exposure. The same chemical that saved human lives was devastating wildlife populations. This irony wasn't lost on later commentators. Rachel Carson, in Silent Spring, acknowledged DDT's role in controlling disease, but argued that its continued widespread use for agricultural pest control was unjustified and dangerous. Her position was nuanced. DDT might be appropriate in limited medical applications where disease risk was high, but broadcasting it across millions of acres of farmland was ecological catastrophe. This distinction between targeted medical use and broad environmental application became central to the DDT debate. Unfortunately, nuance often gets lost in polarized arguments. Back at Okinawa in 1945, these future complications were unknown. What Daniel Crawford and his team knew was that they had a disease emergency and an effective tool to address it. They used that tool as best they could, trying to balance speed and efficiency with respect for the prisoners' humanity. It wasn't perfect. Many prisoners were frightened and humiliated. Cultural sensitivities were trampled. Individual dignity was compromised. But typhus was stopped. Lives were saved. Children who would have died from lice-borne disease grew up, had families, contributed to rebuilding Japan. That outcome mattered, even as the process remained troubling. One detail that often gets lost in historical accounts is the children. Thousands of children were in the camps and they needed DDT dusting just like the adults. For the American soldiers, dusting children was particularly difficult. These were kids, often scared and crying, being held still while strange men sprayed powder on them. Some soldiers, like Tommy O'Brien, found this more emotionally challenging than dealing with adult prisoners. Others focused on the medical necessity, on the fact that children were especially vulnerable to typhus and other lice-borne diseases. The children's reactions varied widely. Some were curious, treating it like a strange game. Others were terrified, requiring restraint. All of them would carry some memory of the experience into adulthood. The elderly prisoners faced different challenges. Many were frail, weakened by malnutrition and the stress of war and capture. Standing for the dusting procedure was difficult, and the powder could trigger coughing or breathing difficulties. Medical staff had to work carefully with elderly prisoners, sometimes conducting the dusting while they sat or lay down. For older Japanese prisoners, the indignity was often compounded by generational values about respect and propriety. Being handled by young foreign soldiers, having powder sprayed into intimate areas, violated every norm they had lived by for decades. Yet they submitted, because the alternative was disease and death. The gender dynamics of the DDT program deserve examination. Male soldiers dusting female prisoners created an inherently gendered power dynamic. The Americans held all the power: military victory, physical control of the camps, authority over life and death. The Japanese women held none. They were defeated, imprisoned, dependent on their captors for food and shelter, and now subject to intimate medical procedures. The fact that the procedure was genuinely medical and life-saving doesn't erase the power imbalance or the gendered vulnerability. Modern historical analysis recognizes this complexity, acknowledging both the medical necessity and the problematic gender dynamics. Some camps tried to address this by having female medical personnel conduct the dusting of women prisoners. However, in 1945, female medical staff were relatively rare in military contexts, and those available were overwhelmed with other duties. Most camps, including Okinawa, simply didn't have enough female staff to handle the massive dusting operations. Male soldiers conducted most of the procedures under supervision and with instructions to be professional and quick. But the fundamental issue remained. The military tried to minimize discomfort, but couldn't eliminate it, given the constraints of the situation. The DDT dusting program also intersected with broader questions about occupied populations and victors' justice. The Americans could have simply let disease run through the camps. They could have prioritized their own troops and let the Japanese prisoners fend for themselves. That they didn't, that they committed resources and effort to preventing typhus among defeated enemies, says something important about American policy in the immediate post-war period. It reflected a conscious decision to treat prisoners humanely, to prevent disease rather than allow suffering. This wasn't purely altruistic, as typhus in the camps could spread to American personnel and civilian populations, but it was also more humane than alternatives chosen by other nations at other times. Compare the American DDT program in Japan to the treatment of prisoners in other contexts. Soviet camps for German prisoners had horrific mortality rates, with disease, malnutrition, and exposure killing hundreds of thousands. Japanese treatment of Allied POWs during the war was notoriously brutal, with widespread disease and deliberate neglect causing massive death rates. The fact that Americans implemented disease control measures for Japanese prisoners, even uncomfortable and invasive ones, represented a relatively enlightened approach by the grim standards of World War II. This context doesn't excuse the violations of dignity, but it provides perspective on the range of choices available to occupying powers. After the dusting was complete and the typhus outbreak controlled, life in the camps gradually improved. Sanitation facilities were upgraded. More food became available as supply lines stabilized. Prisoners began the slow process of repatriation or resettlement. For many, the memory of the white powder dusting faded, becoming just one of many difficult experiences from that chaotic period. For others, like Sachiko and Akiko, it remained vivid, a moment that encapsulated all the strangeness and difficulty of the war's end, when enemies became caretakers and intimate violations became life-saving medicine. The story of DDT dusting in Japanese POW camps is ultimately a story about complexity. It's about young soldiers following orders that made them uncomfortable, but saved lives. It's about prisoners submitting to procedures they didn't understand from people they feared. It's about doctors making hard choices with imperfect options. It's about a chemical that was both miracle and menace, depending on context and timescale. It's about the messy reality of history, which rarely fits into simple narratives of good versus evil, right versus wrong. Lieutenant Daniel Crawford, reflecting years later, perhaps said it best. We did something that felt wrong to achieve something that was right. We violated privacy and dignity to preserve life. I won't apologize for stopping the typhus outbreak. Those people deserved to live. But I also won't pretend it was comfortable or easy or that everyone involved felt good about it. Medicine is like that sometimes. You do what needs to be done, you live with the consequences, and you try to do better next time. The legacy of the DDT program extends beyond the immediate post-war period. It influenced how public health emergencies were handled for decades, establishing precedents about emergency powers, disease control measures, and the balance between individual rights and collective health. When new disease threats emerged, from influenza to Ebola, public health officials drew on lessons learned from programs like the DDT dusting of 1945. Sometimes those lessons were positive, informing effective emergency responses. Sometimes they were cautionary, reminding officials about the importance of consent, cultural sensitivity, and minimizing invasiveness. For the people directly involved, the white powder dusting remained a deeply personal memory. Tommy O'Brien told his grandchildren about it decades later, describing it as one of the strangest experiences of his life. Sachiko Hayashi included it in her published memoir, contextualizing it within the larger narrative of Okinawa's wartime suffering. Akiko Watanabe rarely spoke of it, but when she did, she emphasized what it taught her about the universality of medicine and the possibility of healing even between former enemies. Each of them processed the experience differently, but all recognized its significance. In the end, the story of why U.S. soldiers pumped white powder under the skirts of Japanese POW women comes down to a simple truth wrapped in layers of complexity. The reason was typhus prevention. The powder was DDT. The method was necessary given available technology and the scale of the problem. But that clinical answer doesn't capture the fear, discomfort, violation, and ultimate life-saving impact of the program. It doesn't convey the human dimensions of soldiers and prisoners caught in an impossible situation, trying to navigate between medical necessity and human dignity. That fuller story, with all its complications and contradictions, is what we must remember and learn from. If you found this story as shocking and complex as I did, subscribe to our channel. Give this video a like if you appreciate deep dives into forgotten history, and drop a comment below. What do you think about the balance between public health and personal dignity? Let's discuss this fascinating and difficult piece of history together.